This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today we're going to cover the book Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, by Cormac McCarthy.
As for who recommended the book, that would fall to Jocko Willink, a former Navy SEAL and a leader of the Battle of Ramadi. He is famous for a couple reasons, obviously being a SEAL and for his work in Iraq. But he also has a book out that's called Extreme Ownership, and he does a lot of consulting with companies. And there's
a more recent book that just came out as well.
Yeah. What's it called? The Field Manual.
It's Discipline Equals Freedom, as I recall.
Yeah, Field Manual. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's all black. Pretty cool looking book. But that's out. Extreme Ownership is a book that's on my list for 2018 here. So heard a lot about it just in different podcasts, and I'll tune in on Jocko's podcast every now and then and listen to what he has to say. I'm sure he may have covered this book in one of the episodes, but his podcast is one of those where he is not afraid to go into the dark. And so he did one about the My Lai massacre and during Vietnam, and so he's not afraid to hit some of the more difficult topics. And with his podcast, he actually was encouraged to start that by Tim Ferriss himself. In the second most listened to podcast episode for the Tim Ferriss show, that was the interview of Jocko. And so after that interview, Jocko started his own podcast and is now has quite a bit of success from that. So that's pretty exciting. The author of this book is Cormac McCarthy. You may also know him as the author of All the Pretty Horses and The Road. Those are two of some of his other big books. He is a recluse. I think I pronounced that right.
Yep.
And until his first interview with an unknown upstart named Oprah. So after that, I guess he got pretty well in the public eye. I mean, he was known for his books,
still a bit of a recluse.
Yeah. So shall we begin with the overview of this book?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do our overview. I'm looking forward to your comments on this because I know how much you really loved this book.
Yeah. I was just flipping through the book, and I make notes while I read it, and in one part I just flat out wrote, "I hate this book." And in other parts I wrote, "I wish I had never read this book." So my one word overview is that it is sadistic, and I do wish that I had never read this book. We'll get into why in a little bit, but basically it comes down to this. And Jason, I want to ask you a question. If I were to tell you that I had seen a movie and it was one of the best movies I'd ever seen, it referenced some wonderful movies of the past. So you kind of, it captured different movies like Casablanca or The Godfathers or Braveheart or, some wonderful movies out there. And it referenced old literature, and it was just such a well done movie, such that it's an American classic, but it's rated XXX, and you're going to have images in your head from that movie that will never leave you. Would you go see that movie?
XXX? Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm always complaining that there's not enough sex and violence in our current media fare. So yeah, definitely, I'm all about that. Of course.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I wouldn't, and same goes for this book. It was just, oh man, the amount of violence, but just the depth of the violence and the sadistic nature of the violence. I didn't really know how to handle it. So I also read this book during a time when we were moving from one place to another. And so it took me a month to read the book. And that was the longest out of any of the books. And it's not a super long book, but just with being busy with the move. So it was a terrible book. I mean, I hated reading it. And then it took a long time for me to read it. And then while I move and do stuff like that, I'll listen to a lot of podcasts. And I started listening to a podcast about the Spanish conquest of Mexico.
Was that by chance the History on Fire podcast with Daniela Bolelli?
Yeah, the history. Yeah.
Awesome.
No,
it was a great podcast series on the conquest on the conquest of Mexico.
Yeah,
we'll put some links to that in the show notes. But if you haven't heard it, it's excellent. It's very well done. And the History on Fire podcast is usually pretty well done.
Yeah, his most recent ones of Jack Johnson are
I actually just listened to the third one today.
Oh, okay. I haven't listened to the third one yet.
I like Daniela Bolelli and that podcast. But I could see how they would blur a little bit because there's a lot of violence in that one.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. At the end of the book, I knew. I've heard so much about this book, and it is considered kind of an American classic of some sort.
Why?
And
why?
So I wanted to find out why, and I found a couple of lectures that were done at Yale about the book, and we'll put those in the show notes and maybe discuss those a little bit more. But the lecturer, she talks about readers not being able to get past the gratuitous violence, and that being kind of part of the point of the book. And that was definitely me. I just couldn't get past the past that. But what about you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the violence really didn't bother me all that much. I mean, it's like, okay, well, violence, yay, I guess. There's more violence. All right, well, he's really descriptive on this violence thing. Seems to like violence a lot. Well, there's more blood, and oh look, this guy's just shooting out. He's spending a couple sentences talking about this guy shooting phlegm out of both nostrils. This is it's just the way he works. Okay, so he likes that. Guy seems to be able to write a good description in declarative sentences of gory scenes. All right, yeah. So that didn't really bother me. It's just it is what it is. I mean, not a problem. I can handle violence perfectly well. The problem for me was the book was empty. So it's not the violence that bothered me. It's not if you're talking about gratuitous violence, it's not the violence part that bothers me. It's the gratuity of it.
Yeah. Meaning
that it's just there to be there. And so I found the book empty. I didn't think so. It's one of those things where the philosophy underlying the book, the worldview that the book sort of pushes you toward is something that is fairly at odds with the way that I think, generally speaking, I think about the world, and also I think it's best to think about the world. And so in that sense, I just found it distasteful for that. I would have had no objection to reading a book that was full of far worse violence than this. I mean, heck, the Book of Judges, if you tried to shoot the Book of Judges in the Bible I tell my students this regularly, that if you did the Book of Judges in the Bible as an HBO series or something, there'd be people like campaigning against it because of all the gore and all the nasty stuff in there. I mean, just horrible stuff that's happening in the Book of Judges. I mean, that's just violence is what's going on, and violence is a big part of humanity, unfortunately. But for me, when you include, it's sort of like nudity as well in a movie. I don't really have any objection to nudity. We have bodies, we're all naked under our clothes, okay. But like, what's the point of putting the nude scene in the movie? Are you just putting it in there to titillate and to, get, 17-year-old boys leering or what? I mean, what's the point? If you have a point for it, okay. right? There isn't. For me, the problem is that in this book, there's the end to which the violence goes is basically to say life is nasty, short, and brutish. And that's how humans are, and we just need to reconcile this and, basically come to grips with what human nature is. And I'm just sitting there going, well, I didn't need to read a book to see that, life can be nasty, short, and brutish.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But I mean, and you can see that this, and I pulled a few quotes from the book in terms of the way that he gets this thesis across as he's going through it. One is he has one of his characters, the character through which much of the philosophical discussion comes through. This character of the judge, who we'll talk about later, Judge Holden. This character says all other trades are contained in that of war. And then he's asked, is that why war endures? And he says, no, it endures because young men love it and old men love it in them. Those that fought, those that did not. And so you see, there's a recognition that young men like to fight, and then old men like to fight in young men, and so war is going to continue. And there's this discussion that, well, these people won this battle and so on, but eventually their lot's going to be the same as the people that they conquered, and it's going to keep happening over and over again. And so you get to this, meaningless, everything is meaningless kind of nihilism of this book, and that's really where it goes. And even to the point where the same character a little bit later says, moral law is an invention of mankind for the disenfranchisement of the powerful in favor of the weak. Historical law subverts it at every turn. A moral view can never be proven right or wrong by any ultimate test. And ultimately, he says, decisions of life and death, of what shall be and what shall not, beggar all question of right. Right? So this question of morality, well, what's moral or not? Well, it doesn't really matter, because the people who are going to be able to kill the other people and are stronger are ultimately going to be the ones that write the history, and they're the ones that therefore set the morality to prop up their own position over and against those who are weak. And so the whole thing is a sham, and we just, we need to accept it. And then the person who sees this horror and then realizes that, what? That's how my heart works too. That's okay. Is the one who can dance in the end. I mean, that's sort of where this goes. And to me, that there's an emptiness to that, and it's not. I'll just say this: if we want to read the lies of the poets, to use a Platonic concept, this is not a lie. This is not one of the lies, or even if this were the truth, this is not the one that I would prefer to embrace. Mm-hmm. So that's my initial thoughts on it. But I suppose it's time that we go ahead and get to our favorite quotes section.
Yeah, and you should probably start again, because as usual, you have more than me. This time I just have one.
Yeah, I'll do two of mine. That way I can, make this even a little bit. So the first one is from one of the characters who's, remarking on how remarkable something is. And he says, ain't that the drizzling expletives? Gives you some sense of the kind of what kind of book this is.
Some good one-liners in it.
And then we've got another one. They'd been skinned, and I can tell you it does very little for a man's appearance. You don't say.
Yep.
You don't say. All right. Your favorite quote.
My favorite quote comes at the end of the book. In fact, it's the last two words of the book. And I'll just start out the quote. It goes, "The end."
All right, two more for me.
As stated in the overview, I hated the book, and so my favorite part of the book, favorite quote, was when it all ended. I just wanted it to end.
Yeah, favorite quote for me. Another two more for me. He was crying out to us to piss, man, piss for your very souls. In context, it actually did make a little sense, but it was just exactly the kind of like, wait, what? All right, well, I actually want to shout this out in a bathroom at some point, like in a public restroom at some point. Which, by the way, it shouldn't really be called a restroom. You don't really like go in there and lay down or whatever. It should be a relief room. I really think that the language would be better if it were called a relief room. You go in to relieve yourself, not to rest.
Yeah,
but
good point.
I mean, I guess I've been in one or two like sort of luxury ones that had like a couch in there or something, although I don't know why anybody would actually sit in there, but whatever. Anyway, then my final quote, and this one's actually one that was actually kind of profound and had some meaning, so I figured I'd stick one of those in there. There is no such joy in the tavern as upon the road thereto. I actually think there was some profundity in that. That,
yeah,
you know, you look forward to the debauchery or whatever, you know, the drinking in the tavern, whatever you're going to do in the tavern. You look forward to that. The joy of it is actually greater on the way there. The expectation of it is better than the thing itself, which is, you know, it's an interesting point. And I think it's generally true.
Yeah, and that was a cool scene in the book.
It's one of the few cool scenes in the book.
Yeah, where the Mennonite is basically trying to keep the men from doing what they're about to do, which for a little context for those who have not read the book, and again, we recommend that you do not read the book.
It is not a classic. I'm sorry. It just isn't.
I didn't get it. But
if you want to read a classic that's written in some style, you know, in this kind of terse style, descriptive style, go back and read like The Old Man and the Sea. Right, Hemingway runs circles around this guy who's compared to Hemingway, but at least, you know, based on this particular book, read yourself some Hemingway and skip the McCarthy, or at least skip Blood Meridian. Yeah,
but basically the storyline is we follow a guy who joins unnamed. He joins a crew whose job is to try to kill as many Indians as possible in what is the country of Mexico.
And also New Mexico and, you know, modern New Mexico and Arizona and so on. This is actually based on, it's historical fiction based on the exploits of the Glanton gang, and specifically built on the biography, which to some degree the truthfulness of it is questioned by historians, but the biography of a man who was part of that Glanton gang, which was pretty bloodthirsty and scalped lots of people.
Yeah. Yeah, so you know, a lot of this stuff probably happened, but
well, not as he says it. I mean, he's making it up based on, you know, he's making up his own story sort of to fill in stuff that, well, there was this gang that did a lot of stuff like this, so I'm going to write what I imagine they did.
Yeah,
it's more like that.
Yeah. So getting into the nitty-gritty of the book, there were a lot of allusions to the Bible, to Paradise Lost, to Moby Dick, one of the books that Jason has on his list this year, and also to a Wordsworth poem. But I'm definitely not anywhere near smart enough to catch any of these allusions, and I didn't really care to try. But those Yale lectures that I referred to and that we'll link in the show notes did help me better understand the book, and it gave me a little more appreciation for what Cormac did with the novel. But did you catch? I'm sure you caught a lot more of those allusions.
Oh, sure. I mean, there were lots of allusions all over the place. I mean, even the nihilism of the book, there in some of the ways that he puts things. I mean, it's reminiscent of the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, which is, you know, one of my favorite books of the Bible, actually. But I mean, there's allusions all over the place, and you know, he does layer a lot of stuff in there, and there's a lot of historical research that went into this in terms of dates and times and where the Glanton gang was at this time and some of the things that they actually did that's known. So, you know, he does work within that, but then he kind of lets his imagination carry off and you know, creates a based on a few historical events story out of it. So yeah, I mean, there's stuff I caught, but I just didn't find it all that compelling what he did with those things generally. So, and again, I mean, the writing, I mean, he's a descriptive writer. He can certainly paint a beautiful picture of a landscape before explaining that there's, a couple skinned bodies strung up from the heels, bleeding down into that beautiful landscape, and do that in equal detail. But he's clearly a gifted writer who had a lot of capacity to work in all sorts of different illusions and so on. But again, I don't think that in itself makes a book worth reading.
And have you read anything else by him?
I have not.
I read all the Pretty Horses, but it was so long ago that I couldn't even tell you anything about it. So I don't remember if I enjoyed that one or not.
Yeah, I don't know. I hear that and I think of My Little Pony, so that's clearly not the same. So,
well, it was. I do know it wasn't as violent as this one.
Well, that's not a high bar to clear.
Yeah. I guess the other big thing we can discuss is the character of Judge Holden. It is a pretty memorable character and one that unfortunately will stick with you after reading it. What were your thoughts on the judge?
I really don't have a whole lot of thoughts on the judge. I mean, he seems, as far as I can tell, to be very. He's repeatedly portrayed as in terms that are, he is like, and then kind of pick your image of some evil spirit or demonic presence or whatever, and the men that he's with are always kind of in awe of his celerity and all of these things in ways that suggest that perhaps he's got some sort of supernatural aspect to him. And then by the end of the book, I think it's increasingly clear that he sort of stands in as similar to like the Satan character in Paradise Lost, right? That he is a kind of satanic character, and you're left with this sense that he's actually a supernatural being. Though again, that's left somewhat ambiguous. But I think that's the impression that McCarthy wants to leave the reader with, or at least writes it in such a way that most readers would be left with that particular impression. So, I mean, I don't clearly and again, we're in the nitty gritty here, so some spoiler alerts. Although this isn't that big of a spoiler, when he's making the gunpowder and out of which you get that out of which you get that quote, "Piss for your very souls." When he's making that, I mean, you've got some allusions in terms of some of these things as well to that kind of image. So there's some suggestion again that that it's Satan at work in the Glanton gang, and that they're following in some way, this guy who's helping them produce all of these awful things. But at the same point, he's also just portrayed as a kind of an especially gifted and bulky man. So, again, there's some ambiguity. I didn't find him all that compelling of a character, to be honest.
Well, I did. The one thing that was just so weird is he would get cultural artifacts, draw them as best he could, describe them in his book, in the book that Judge Holden carried around with him, and then he would either burn or destroy the artifact.
Yeah, he'd sketch it out.
Yeah, so as long as he had it in his memory or in his book, it was okay, but he didn't want anyone else to enjoy that culture. And I guess if the whole goal of your gang is to go through and kill as many people of this culture that you can, you would probably just, it wouldn't matter to you to get rid of the culture. But then why is he so interested in the culture to draw it before he destroys it?
Well, I think actually there's probably some reflection in terms of how McCarthy's drawing this up, that what the judge is doing is he's basically writing history in a manner of speaking, sort of through cultural artifacts. He's recording the artifacts, but the things themselves he's destroying. And and I think there's some suggestion that humanity works, that things work the same way for human beings and history, that, well, we get recorded, we leave our mark in the book of history. And see, I think the Judge's book is kind of metaphorical for this idea for history. And that, because you have a few places where he talks about how human beings all wind up in a book of one book or another, right? Mm-hmm. And, there's this implication that, it's, again, alluding to the book of life, perhaps, from the Bible, history books, what book you wind up in, what books you wind up in, those are there. But the thing is, you wind up in those books, but the essence, the very thing itself, you're going to die. You're going to be destroyed. And so, once you've gone down in history, well, you'll eventually be destroyed and you'll be no more. But, your sketch, the memory of you, which is only a shadow, a shade of you, is all that remains. And I think that's, to some degree, what's going on and how that is. And again, the Judge is someone who revels in death.
What comes to my mind is the Genghis Khan book we read, where Genghis Khan and the Mongols would destroy culture or destroy whole people groups, and there not be any trace left. Not like with this example, there's at least a sketch of the artifact, but with that, there's nothing left. There's not even the sketch. It's like they
right. They're erased
killed
from
everybody.
The history
they
books.
demolished
They're
everything.
Erased from memory. They're erased from any cultural artifact. Yeah, absolutely. But here again, the point is, there's lots of stuff that won't be remembered. And what he's doing is he's saying, oh, I'm going to make sure that it's remembered, at least in my book, even though the book may be forgotten or whatever. It's going to be recorded and remembered, but the thing itself will be destroyed. And again, he revels in death, but he seems to like the story.
Yeah.
Right? He seems to like what leads up to it to some degree, so long as it suits his kind of nasty ends. And of course, he's a pretty awful there are so many aspects of the Judge that throughout this, and once again, we're in the spoiler zone, so if you want to skip ahead a few 30 seconds or so, you can miss some things. But over and over again, you see that some underage girl disappears in a place in some place where they wind up, and it's usually connected with the Judge's presence in some way. And then, he winds up with little boys at different points. There's one particular time where he takes a little Apache boy captive and rides with that boy, over his saddle. And then he is, clearly over a few days, spending time with the boy. And eventually he's dandling the boy on his lap. And then a few minutes later, the boy's dead. Right. Mm-hmm. So, and so what you find is that, he's a pedophile and butcher, kills multiple children, basically rapes and kills multiple children throughout the narrative behind the scenes. You don't really see what's going on until toward the end, when some of the stuff that he's doing is revealed again in a scene where the Glanton gang is basically busted. They finally reach their end, and you see what happens, what's going on behind the scenes with the Judge, though, again, he doesn't have the same fate as the rest of the Glanton gang. So yeah, the way that he is portrayed throughout, there's nothing positive about him. He's a strong proponent of nihilism, and given that nihilism, once you recognize that everything is nasty and brutish, well, I might as well just use my might to sadistically enjoy myself at others' expense as often as I want. Mm-hmm. Right? That seems to be the take that he does. He doesn't blur any lines, right? He denies that there's good in humanity and then embraces that as a character. One more spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read it and do intend to read it. Skip ahead by about 30 seconds.
Yeah, and I just thought it was ironic that the entire book, each killing is described in such horrific detail until the last murder of the book, which is apparently so horrific that Cormac couldn't couldn't write about
Well,
it.
that he chose not to write about it in order to make you feel that it must have been so much worse than anything else he puts in.
You're just left to imagine. So
yeah,
nice.
Left to imagine what happens when a gigantic naked man attacks another man in an outhouse.
Yeah,
that's what a great ending.
So, it just kind of goes back to the first thing I asked about. You know, if this was a movie, would you go see it? And I'm very careful with the movies I watch because I just don't want certain things in my head. And to read a book like this, put things in my head that I don't want there. And it's really the only book of the ones we read this year that did that. But yeah, I still really wish I had not read the book because those things are still in my head, and I'm careful in other parts of my life to not allow that. And
have you seen the movie Pulp Fiction?
I think I did a long time. I don't know if I made it through the whole thing, but yeah, I mean, it's a similar reaction.
Yeah, this actually, the book reminded me in a lot of respects of Pulp Fiction. Yeah, which, some of my friends think Pulp Fiction is one of the best movies ever, that it's a classic. And generally, I like Tarantino. Generally, I like a lot of Tarantino stuff, but Pulp Fiction was one of those films that I just, as I was watching it, was just like, it wasn't the violence, it was the nihilism of it. It was like, come on, man, right? It's not going anywhere. Yeah, and that was kind of my reaction here as well. So if you really, really like Pulp Fiction, then you'll probably like this book.
Yeah, and when I posted stuff on our Books of Titans Instagram account about this book, I mean it's a polarizing book. So I got some feedback that the people loved this book, and then other feedback that people hated it. There's not really like a middle ground.
No, this is not a book that's capable of middle ground, I don't believe. Yeah. No. And again, I think a good test is if you like Pulp Fiction, if you've seen Pulp Fiction and you really think it's one of the best movies ever, then you probably enjoy this book to some degree. Yeah. But if you watch Pulp Fiction and you're kind of like either not really a fan, or you just find it like completely empty and nihilistic and pointless, or if you have some objection, to the kind of violence there, which again, that's not my issue. But if that's your response, then I strongly recommend that you just find another book. Yeah.
I ranked every in conclusion here. I ranked every book of the books that we read for the 2017 list, and this one was at the very end. So of all the books we read,
it's number 52.
I just despised it. And so if you have read it and you're kind of confused on it, I do suggest listening to those two Yale lectures. They really helped me in understanding the book more and what Cormac McCarthy was attempting to do. It didn't make me like the book anymore, but I guess just appreciate more of what he was trying to do. So I would listen to that. But if you haven't read the book, unless, as Jason just said, you like Pulp Fiction, then maybe you'll like this one. But there's a lot better books out there, and I can't. I could never recommend this even if I knew of someone who loved Pulp Fiction. I still would never recommend this book that someone would read it.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you've said multiple times that this book stuck with you so much, and you've got in the show notes here as I'm looking at them. Definitely a book that will stick with you. And I'm looking at your notes. I found myself thinking about the characters, the incidents, and dialogue from the book days after reading it. And the funny thing about that is this book hasn't stuck with me at all.
Really?
Like, I just found it empty and was like, okay, well, that's done. Like, there are a number of the books that we've read that have stuck with me. Like, it's a book that, like, man, I'm going to go back to that. Like, that. There's some ideas in there that I've just got my wheels turning. This book, I finished it, and I'm like, well, okay, the end. Yeah. Great. It just hasn't stuck with me at all.
And I maybe it was the writing where just the scenes are so vivid that it's kind of still in my imagination, or I don't know what it was about it, but I mean, obviously the violence and the horrific nature of what happens. I just kind of think back to that, and it's like, man, I just wish that wasn't in my head, but
yeah,
it is.
As for me, I mean, again, it comes back less to that fact of the violence and more to the gratuitous nature of it in terms of it being empty. There not being anything redeeming in this book. And it gets back to a commonly cited insight or opinion of Chesterton's, G.K. Chesterton, that resonates a lot with me. And that's specifically, I don't need to read stories to know that the world is nasty and brutish and that humans have evil in their heart and that monsters exist. I don't need to watch a movie or read a book to tell me how nasty human beings can be to one another. Mm-hmm. I don't need that. I don't need fiction to be like, yeah, man, life is hard, and don't you get thinking that life is really easy and that people are great. I don't need that, because that's something I already know. What I need and what I want are stories that show that the monsters can be defeated. Mm-hmm. And to help inspire me to do so in my own context. And this is the kind of work, the kind of fictional work that lacks that. It lacks the push toward redemption. It lacks the inspiration to do, what's right and what's good. There's if we're going to be covering Plato's Republic not too long from now. I think that's the next one for us. But in the Republic, there's some discussion, and in Plato in general, in Platonism, there's this idea that great art reflects upon the good and the beautiful, and I don't see a whole lot of that in this particular book. If anything, it's reflecting upon the emptiness and the void, and mm-hmm. I would rather that things get to the opposite end. Now, the actual quote, by the way, from G.K. Chesterton, we'll put it in the show notes, is this, as he's talking about fairy tales for children. He says, fairy tales, then, are not responsible for producing in children fear, or any of the shapes of fear. Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of the evil or the ugly. That is in the child already, because it is in the world already. Fairy tales do not give the child his first idea of bogey. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of bogey. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides him is a St. George to kill the dragon. And again, this book is simply a reflection on the dragon. And for me, I lose interest fairly quickly with those sorts of things. I want there to be some sort of, even if it's subtle, some sort of indication of where this should go in a redemptive sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's going to do it for us today. This is our first episode of 2018, so Happy New Year, Jason.
Yeah.
We
1 year older.
We are all over booksoftitans.com. I've done a lot of work on the site the last couple of weeks with updating our new reading list for 2018. Jason and I have a combined reading list. And then I've also have our list separated out for what we'll both be reading this year. So we're also at Books of Titans on Instagram and Twitter. And next week, the next book is Generations. And we're going to kind of be going back and forth between the 2017 books and the 2018 books. So for 2018, Jason and I are both reading 26 books that were suggested in the Tim Ferriss Show podcast. So there's 1,500 plus books from that list. So we've each chosen 26 from that. And so the podcast in the upcoming year here is going to take more of an interview format. So for the person who's read the book, the other person will do more of an interview of the other person about the book. So we'll be intermixing the podcast going forward, but
and sometimes we'll probably do more than one in a week as a result of that.
Yeah. Yep. So the next one will either be Generations or it'll be one of the first books that we are reading. But go to booksoftitans.com. The homepage has the books that we're currently reading, and you can follow along with us there. We'd love for you to read some of the books that we're reading as well. might make the podcast a little more enjoyable to be reading along with us. So thanks for listening. We'd love your feedback on any of the episodes. Ratings in iTunes would be a big help. Thanks for listening. On behalf of Jason Staples,
Hello.
I'm Eric Rostad, and this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening.
Keep reading. Well, maybe not this book.
Not this one.
Keep improving and keep listening.
Keep it real. We'll keep it.